Welcome back to Flight 2 of the Intro to Italian Wine. Now, I normally like to do instant cartography and draw maps in front of people, but here I drew it during the break. I'd like to take this flight and relate back to a little bit of what we discussed in terms of geography, and of course you know that has some legal relations. That little story I told you about Italian white wine, and then jump into this flight of wines, taking you down further into Italy and into its history. But first, let's take a look at the map and just plant the first flight's wines on the map. Now, this of course is entirely drawn to scale, so here you have Rome, and up here would be Milan. Now, if you fly into Milan, it's a kind of chaotic international airport, but you can then take a short car ride down and you'll reach the tiny town, and it's a college town of Alba. Just below Alba is the zone of Barolo, and just beside Alba is the zone of Barbaresco. So that gives us our first two wines of that first flight. Now, over here, if you go up into this area, and ooh, is that large, this is the area that is Friuli. Friuli is where we tasted that Yerman white wine from, and it, of course, spans off into what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but is now separated into many different countries. A fascinating place to visit for so many reasons. So with that in mind, let's posit where we're going now, and we're going down to central Italy, and I'm going to guess we're going to go to a place that you've heard of called Chianti. Now I'm going to draw one more town in here, Florence, and Chianti essentially starts right below Florence and extends down. Now Chianti. We'll do an entirely separate lecture on the wines you're going to taste here, Chianti, Super Tuscan, and also a Brunello. But let's just say there's a lot to explore in Chianti, and there's a lot we could talk about with Chianti's DOC and DOCG zones. I'm going to, though, try and take it in broad strokes, hopefully to perk your interest in these amazing wines, and again, like I said, give you some of the cultural and history of the region, and hopefully get you to explore that next lecture we have. Okay. To introduce Chianti, I want you to take a thought back to Yerman, but of course I also want you to drink wine at the same time and don't want to leave you hanging. Now, if you were from Wisconsin, you'd be a good Wisconsinite and know that you can double fist in Wisconsin all the time. And that's what I'd like you to do here. I'd actually like you to take wine number 1, which is a Chianti Classico. It's from Paolo De Marchi, and it's the winery Isole Iolina. And then I'd like to have you have in your other hand the Mirvalia, the Maestro from Mirvalia. Now, if you just smell these back and forth, I think they smell incredibly different from one another. I'll describe them later, but you just think about it, and I think anyone can realize they smell very different. And I also think if you then taste them, they taste really different than one another. And I think it's fascinating both because they're delicious wines, but also because that taste and that smell relates to the history of Chianti. So let me link that back to Yerman. Now Yerman came back to, as I said, Italy in order to make Italian wine and make Italian wine world class. Now where did he get that inspiration from? To my understanding, where he got that inspiration from was actually the region of Chianti and what was going on with Chianti in the 1960s. So that's why we turn here to Chianti. Now, Chianti has a different way of operating, or had a different way of operating than Barolo and Barbaresco, even though it contains some of Italy's absolute most famous wines. So if Yerman had his idea in the 1970s, and he was reflecting on the development of Chianti in the 1960s, what was going on before? Well, going on before was a 2,000-year history of making wine, much of which was actually documented for the last 1,000 years, leading us to Chianti. But I want to take you very quickly, again in broad strokes, up to 1945 and walk you into the 1960s while you continue tasting these two wines. course, the years 1945 to 1960 were not great ones for Italy and not great ones for Chianti Classico, Chianti. This was a region that was recovering from wartime, and it was also a region that was struggling with its past history of how it dealt with farmers. Now, if the joke in Barolo was that Barolo was the wine of the king because he took the production, here in Chianti you actually have lots of little kings, which is why you have constant warring between Florence and Rome. It's also why many of the wineries contain towers, or many of the towns contain towers that are so beautiful to see from today, or the towns are built on hilltops. It's because you could watch for warring armies. Well, how does that relate to us? With the devastation of World War II and also the financial crisis that came afterwards, what happened in Chianti was a production issue. Now, if you think most people, maybe a little bit older than the current audience, have an association with Chianti as Chianti in the fiasco bottle, the round straw or wicker bottle that you stuck a candle in and then you put at your Italian restaurant with the white and red checkered tablecloth. If you have no reference point to that, just watch The Godfather Part 1 and you'll get the stereotype. Now, for a portion of time, that stereotype of the fiasco bottle, and that's why we actually get the term fiasco, is because what will follow, was important to Chianti because it was inexpensive wine that of course was being produced there, and people were buying it. And that was great. It resulted in a boom. Now, unfortunately, what happened with that boom was that most of the landholders decided to increase production. Hey, if you've got a boom and you want to rebuild your country, this is perfect timing to do it. Well, Chianti is a demarcated zone, and you can't really get much more land out of Italy. And so what that meant is if you're increasing production, you generally then have to crop heavier. Now, with grapes and with winemaking, usually the thought process, and I think these two things are linked, is if you crop heavier, yes, you're getting more liquid volume, but you're getting less flavorful liquid. So the resulting wine is, again, a little bit less flavorful than if you would have cropped lower. Now in Chianti, this situation got pretty drastic as the 60s came along. There was immense cropping of grapes, and in fact, producers turned to other grape varieties that could crop even heavier. Chianti was usually made with Sangiovese, but back then you could have 30% white grape varieties. And those white grape varieties could yield enormous volume, but of course tasted like nothing. So what you have is this huge explosion of production, but the wine quality is getting inferior. And eventually what's happened is the absolute bust of the market. Unfortunately, most of Chianti's production was thought to be just crap and sold for pennies on the dollar. Also, unfortunately, is Chianti was a system of lords and landowners. The people actually cropping the land didn't own it. This became a huge financial crisis to the point that I've read 75% of the population of Chianti left by the early 1960s simply because they couldn't make a living. Indeed, to my understanding, a region in Chianti we're not going to taste, Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, had no operating producers left in it by 1972. Okay, why all that huge history? Because I think it brings us down to the flavor of these two wines that I asked you to keep drinking, because I'm more interesting the more you drink. Trust me on that one fact. Now, if we separate off and we just take the second one to start with and smell that and taste that one, what I think we can notice is there's an expression of very ripe, concentrated fruit. I think the fruit side really shows over the savory and flowery side. I think you can also sense that there's some new oak in there, giving it a little vanilla and spice and barrique. And then when you have it on the palate, it's got a nice fruit character, still good structure, but that kind of feel of its fruit and body is luxurious. It tastes different than our Barolos and Barbarescos, and it also tastes different than our Chianti with Isola e Uvina. Why is that? It's because it belongs to a category of wines that in the 1960s got to be known as Super Tuscans. What are Super Tuscans? I think the best way to put it now is a Super Tuscan is a wine that's being made that would not have been traditional. I would have to add the caveat, not have been traditional throughout the 1970s and 1960s. Right now, in this day and age, and this is why I chose this producer, this region that it's from, Bulgari, this is actually the tradition. But for us, it's going to be a link from the past to the current side. So Super Tuscan, a wine that was made that was not traditional. Now, why would that happen? Well, there's one man that we can credit, and a couple that followed him, and a little bit of argument because this is Italy, but we'll talk about a man named Antinori. He's famous, he makes a lot of Tuscan wine. His family is one of the barons of the wine world. Antinori, in the 1960s, had the idea of, wait a second, my family lives in a region and has made wine in this region, and indeed has been a count of this region for 1,000 years. Why is it that we have driven our wine down to the lowest common denominator, such to the point that people can't even live off of making wine anymore? Well, his thought is he needed to reinvigorate, and what he decided to do to reinvigorate was to actually alter the blend of Chianti. Instead of having Sangiovese coupled with grape varieties that were white or grape varieties that were high producing, he coupled Sangiovese with international varieties, specifically French varieties of Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc. He put them into a blend with the idea that he was making the best possible Chianti that he could. Now, the first 2 years he made that wine got to be called Chianti, and in fact, I think got to be called Chianti Reserva. Unfortunately, the Italian government actually struggled with him a bit and had some arguments with him. And what they said is, you can't make Chianti with the grapes that you're making. Furthermore, your modern style of making it with these new oak barrels, that's not allowed either. You have to follow tradition. Antinori pushed back, and the pushback was, well, if tradition has led us here, something needs to change. And in fact, if the laws of Chianti have enshrined low quality production, then we must change them and we must go forward. The Italian government didn't agree, and they forced him to declassify his wine, meaning that on the label, he wasn't able to write Chianti, and in fact, on the early labels of his wine, he wasn't able to write the vintage either. They forced him into a legal category called Vino di Tavola, which would be table wine. The stuff of common legend of you just go up to someone's barn and pull yourself a big pitcher of red wine and drink it with pizza. Okay, Antinori responded and he said, well, fine, I'll lose all of that because I'm right and I'm making better wine. And instead, what I'll do is I'll put a proprietary name on the label and drop everything else. Now, the proprietary name he chose was Tignello. And we occasionally get allocated Tignello, and it's a wonderful wine still being made today, and it's the birth of Super Tuscans. Again, to pull you forward, and I hope you've drunk through all of this, here is not the birth, but the current state of Super Tuscans. This property, Brindvalia, is brand new, and they're out on Bulgari. Bulgari is out here on the Tuscan coast, Bulgari, and it's the home to some of Italy's most expensive wines and some of its most dramatic red wines, and some whites coming too, but they are almost all in that category of Super Tuscan. This wine they gave the proprietary name of Maestro, hence the name there. It's not a legal thing. It's not saying that he's about to conduct an orchestra if you drink it. It's just the proprietary name of the wine. Now, more so for us right now, as of this vintage, I think it's fascinating because many producers have turned towards Cabernet Franc. and Cabernet Franc with the idea that Cabernet Franc will be the new experience of Tuscan wines, the new height of Tuscan wines. So a really modern phenomena wrapped up into an old one. Okay, but what about that first bottle? Where did we leave that? Well, we left that in 1960 with the fiasco and the collapse of the Italian, Chianti countryside in terms of making wine. One of the reactions to that was, of course, to make super Tuscans. Another reaction that came along much later, came along in the 1980s, was a decision to turn back and look again at the classical grape varieties of Italian wine. Or I should say Chianti wine. That producer who was revolutionary in that direction is actually with us here in this bottle. Now the man is named Paolo De Marchi. The winery is called Isole Iolina. Now his thought process was, and again this is taking us to the 1980s, looking around and seeing that wines labeled Chianti were still thought to be fairly poor quality, still had all kinds of white grapes, other grapes, high production being blended into them, selling for pennies. And then on the other side though, you had these super Tuscans which were now selling for hundreds, but also had French grapes in them, Cab, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and also had French production methods in them. I think his thought was, well, why can't we in Chianti make wines that are great and world-class, but also use only Chianti's native grapes? The idea being that Chianti wine shouldn't taste like Cabernet, Merlot, Cabernet Franc. It should taste explicitly Italian, and with that, the link being it should be made with Italian grapes. Now, Paolo De Marchi's most famous wine is Cepparello, and we do indeed on occasion get allocated Cepparello. But his Cepparello is 100% Sangiovese, and his Isole Iolina Chianti Classico is a beautiful wine as well, a little bit more accessible and not as allocated to us as Cepparello, hence I wanted to show you that. Now again, if you go and taste these two side by side and focus on this one for a moment, I think what you get is this beautiful smell of Sangiovese. To me, Sangiovese always has a red cherry fruit character to it. And then these things may not impress you, but please hold on, has always a sense of dusty, if you don't like the word dusty, arenaceous is a $5 word to replace it, but dusty tannins, and then also high acidity that I think for some people, you could almost say it comes across as sour. Now, of course, sour isn't gonna help me sell it to you, but I think that nicely describes Chianti's flavor profile. Now, I love this, and I think one of the wonderful things, two wonderful things about Chianti, especially this bottle, is it fits with so many different foods, and it's also always ready to go and drink. I really never popped open a Chianti and thought something like a red Burgundy of, oh, it just needs more time. It's always ready to drink. And then if you think about all of the most popular Italian, or if you want Italian-American foods, spaghetti with meatballs, if you think about any kind of pizza, pepperoni, you think about the famous one from Florence, beefsteak Florentina, grilled steak with olive oil, arugula salads, prosciutto, olives, all of those super classical Italian dishes that we have, spaghetti with meatballs even. Chianti is the perfect match. It's those arenaceous tannins, and it's that high acidity that make it go so incredibly well with food. Okay, that was a lot to digest, and I hope you got to drink through it all. I hope it's also a wonderful touchstone for you in thinking about Chianti's history and culture and the wines and how they relate. I'd encourage you to, of course, join us for one of our future sessions that's just about Chianti, but also at some point, traveling there is an amazing experience, and they welcome Americans. It's beautiful countryside. Go if you get the chance. In the first flight, I mentioned the two big B's of the Italian wine world. One of them is, of course, Barolo. The other one is Brunello, which leads us to our bonus round of this flight. Normally, we do 3 wines a flight. Here we have 4. I felt that I couldn't not show you a Brunello, and so I just had to give you an extra wine. You, of course, at home can choose to do all 4 at once, or you can just focus in on the Brunello. Now let me put Brunello on the map. It's actually right down here. And you'll notice the full name on the bottles is Brunello di Montalcino. And the reason for that is the town is named Montalcino, and Brunello, the wine, comes from the region around the town. Most Americans shorten it to Brunello. Now, Brunello, as a grape variety, is actually 100% Sangiovese, meaning the wine in there has to be 100% Sangiovese. Most producers in Montalcino would take exception to that, and they would say that the grape variety is Sangiovese Grosso, and it's genetically distinct from Chianti Sangiovese. Whether or not you believe that, we can know one thing that's clear, is Brunello is to the south of Chianti, and therefore it's warmer. It makes a richer style of Chianti. So if our Isola Iolina had beautiful red fruit to it, to me, Brunellos almost always have a black fruit character to them, bordering on mocha or chocolate in a beautiful, wonderful way. Now, Brunello, for many, many years, probably its first 150 years, 200 years of its existence, meaning the wine was in production, was made only in a few vintages by a man named Biondi Santi. Biondi Santi firmly believed that Brunello should be the greatest wine of Italy and therefore should show up only when it's in the greatest vintage. I think in his lifetime, he made something like only 4 vintages of Brunello. And in fact, over the entire history of Brunello, until the 1980s, let's say, there were very, very few vintages declared, and it was quite scarce. Now, Brunello has a linked-in history with me and us as Americans, which is that it's extremely popular in America. And so over the years, and particularly this trend accelerated in the 90s, more and more Brunello was being made, more and more producers were coming to Brunello to make wine, and then more of it was being sold to the US. I think as of 2000, 75% of Brunello's production was actually destined to be consumed by us here in the US. Now, Brunello itself has to be aged longer than Chianti, which is always why it seems older, I don't want to say old, but older upon release. It typically is 4 years, with some travel time, maybe 4.5, before we see Brunello come to us. So a long time, and it used to be a long time aged in wood. Now, I can tell you the idea of Brunello is that it's the most dramatic statement of Sangiovese that Italy makes. Of course, Chianti producers would argue with that, but let's keep that in our heads. The most dramatic statement of Sangiovese that Chianti produces, or that Italy produces. The idea being that rich fruit on the nose and is echoed on the palate. The long oak aging and its relatively high tannins have given it a potential to age forever in the bottle, and also its high acidity keeps it elegant and vibrant. When it's young, oftentimes to me, it's a big, powerful wine, really pairing well with richer dishes, and here the beef stecca Florentina is perfect. But as it ages, it gains this exceptional elegance and finesse. With this producer, and this is Gianni Brunelli, I think you are getting an amazing example of it. This just came to us. It's the 2015 vintage as of this taping. I love the work that Gianni Brunelli does, or rather his wife does. We'll explore this more in yet another lecture, but one thought of Brunello is it's a hilltop town, and the vineyards surround the hilltop. So the vineyards are oriented in different ways. You can actually go through Brunello and taste that producer by producer. Here, her main vineyard is actually on the southeast facing, which is going to give you exceptionally powerful Brunello and very long-lived. Okay, that is the second big B of Italy. Now, we're going to leave, and I want to end the flight on white wine to give us a little bit of refreshment, and we're just going to go over to this side, the Adriatic side of the country, and we're going to go to a place called the Castello de Hesi. I wanted to go here because I think this producer is important, and I also want to get beyond Pinot Grigio as the only Italian white wine. Not that Yermans was bad, I think in fact it was exceptionally good, but I want to show you that the diversity that's in red wines in Italy also exists in white wines. So here with Bucci, you have the story of a man named Peleo Bucci, who actually went off and as a young man left his family's vineyards left his family farm over in the Hayseed. What he did was he went into the fashion industry in Milan, and he was in the fashion industry for most of his life and made, I presume, a boatload of money. Eventually, he developed a wine habit and kind of fell in love with drinking French wines. Now, this story you've heard before, but I've heard it a lot from producers, and I think it's true. Once he fell in love with French wines, the thought occurred to him, well, wait a second. I have a family farm, a family vineyard that's been in my family for generations, and it's making white wine, it's making Italian white wine, and the grape Verdicchio. Why can't my family's winery be famous? Why can't Verdicchio occupy the same designation that Chardonnay does in the rest of the world? And so with that, he took his money and reinvested in his family farm, and he is the seminal producer of this Castello de Hayseed. And I think it's Jesi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So as the seminal producer, he took what at the time would have been a grape variety that was probably just being blended away into bulk wine, and he used modern winemaking techniques to bring it up and bring it into this style of wine, which I think is really dramatic. Now, with modern winemaking techniques, I don't mean to imply, because I don't think it's there, that he made the wine un-Italian. Different thought than what we had with Chianti. Here, I think you get the beautiful expression of Verdicchio, which is white flower, so it has that flowery aroma. And it also has, and I think this is purposeful, just a touch of almond to it. And maybe at the finish of the palate, a little touch of almond skin, giving it a hint of bitter. Again, I realize that bitter probably doesn't sell a wine to you, but think of food and think of the pairings with food, and that just touch of the clip on your tongue gives you the idea that you need to drink another glass and gives just the ultimate feeling of refreshment. So again, please keep exploring Italian white wine, even as you fall in love with Italian red wine. Join us for the next flight.